welcome to this, and this will be something a little different. It will be a Q&A, but it will be a Q&A on MMA, because I got a pretty good selection, I would say, of MMA questions that I wanted to answer, but there was a fairly good number of them, so I figured I would just do one by themselves. And also, the last question kind of leads into kind of an Affliction rant. So I thought this would be a good kind of deal to kind of put them together and just kind of do one video for the whole thing. So let's get started. Hey Truthslayer, just like to know your thoughts on Satoshi Ishii, I think that's how you pronounce his name, possibly joining the UFC and where he could bring, what he could bring to the UFC. Thanks. I don't know. I know that supposedly K1 has offered him a ton of money to fight and dream, and probably more than what he will be in UFC, but I think he would rather fight in UFC. What is he, a judo gold medalist, I think, or a judo Olympian in Japan? Can't remember now off the top of my head. But what he could bring to UFC, well, according to Dana, and I don't believe Dana when he talks about this, but apparently they were, I believe after the last pay-per-view, someone actually asked him, or he started talking to him, I don't know which. If someone actually asked him the question, big thumbs up. More people need to ask him crap like this. About Japan. He started talking about Japan bringing in Japanese wrestlers, particularly Kid Yamamoto and some others, I guess. I can't remember now. But they started talking about that. He also started talking about maybe even doing a show, I believe, in Japan. So he would definitely need a guy like this to do that, because you need somebody. The Japanese like to root for one of their own, and so you need someone of a fairly high caliber to fight in Japan. So he definitely would bring that. He would definitely probably, because Dana has continually talked about trying to make MMA bigger around the world. He's even talked about making it bigger than soccer. Not that I ever see that happen, but he's talked about it. To do that, in my opinion, that means he's going to have to rebuild MMA in Japan, where it's fairly dead at the moment. There's various reasons for that, and I think that that's one of the reasons why you will probably not see him go to UFC. Put a UFC show in Japan in the near future, and he will say, you know, it's because of politics and numerous other things and the media over there and all of that. Honestly, in my opinion, the reason why you probably won't see a UFC fight over there, in my opinion, is because they're not going to put on a quality heavyweight fight in Japan, because they're going to see it as a throwaway show since it will be a tape show. That's why, because you're not going to be able to draw the type of numbers they're going to need to draw to do a Japanese show if you're not going to put on a quality heavyweight matchup, in my opinion. I could be completely wrong about that. People can say I'm an idiot for saying that, but I think that's a big thing. And that means you're going to have to do Lesnar and somebody else, and it'd have to be someone of quality. And therein lies the problem. I don't think they're willing to do that, because Lesnar's too big of a draw here in the U.S. to give him a throwaway match over there. And I also think you would have to at least have one, maybe two of the guys that were stars in Pride as well. So it'd have to be a fairly star-studded show for it to be any kind of success. UFC, when they did run Japanese shows, why they were successful, they probably weren't as successful as people would think, considering what K1 and what Pride was drawing at the same time over in Japan. So definitely that's where I could see him bringing, as them a guy who could probably draw over there, but I don't necessarily think it would work. But it would definitely open more doors, I would say that. I'm not too sure if it would work, but there you go. Do you think there should be a roof on the heavyweight class in MMA in terms of actual weight? If so, where do you think the bound should be set? I personally don't. And the reason is, if you can name me 15 guys in the last 10 years of MMA that would be super heavyweights, that would be quality guys, then yes. But I don't think you can do that. I have seen very few guys that I would call quality. Brock Lesnar being one of them, of course, and I would say Rulon Gardner would have been the other one if he had stuck with MMA. But other than that, I don't think you really have that many guys. I mean, you would have Mark Hunt, but you know, Mark Hunt wouldn't be considered an elite fighter. I don't think it's a good fighter, but not an elite fighter. I guess you could say Bob Sapp in his prime, but again, at best you would call him good. I'm sure there's a few other guys that I'm just not thinking of that would be of, a super heavyweight class. But I just don't see enough guys at that weight class to justify, putting a cap on the heavyweight class. Now, I understand why they do it, because they say, that's too much weight for guys to give up, except I've seen guys beat guys that were bigger than them, that were super heavyweights, and that were good super heavyweights. I've seen Mark Hunt lose to both Fedor and I believe, did he ever fight Nog? I think he fought Nog. I know Nog fought Sapp, and he beat Sapp. So there's definitely guys, and I would even say, Randy was pretty much keeping his own to a degree against Brock until, Brock basically had the perfect punch in a lot of ways. So, I don't see it being that big of a deal, and I also think you're limiting the talent you can bring in, particularly from Greco-Roman wrestling, where you have a lot of quality guys that would probably be very good in MMA, and you're basically saying, well, you can't be in here. And the fact that a guy like Alexander Karelin would not be allowed to be in MMA, to me, is just insane. And, that would be my problem with that's my problem with, UFC's weight limit. And what happens to UFC if Brock does become this big, nasty star over the next 2 years, and then magically, as he, in 2 years, he starts having problems making weight? I mean, that's a legit reality that could happen. And so there's that to add on to it too. So I just don't agree with it. I've never liked it. So there you go. Would you say that Affliction has passed UFC and is now better than UFC, or is UFC still the top brand in MMA? This is quite funny and ridiculous, to be completely honest, because there's no way Affliction is even close. Have both their shows been better than UFC's? For the most part, I would say yeah, but I think a lot of that has to do with they put on 2 shows, where UFC's probably put on, 8 in the same time frame, at least. Just off the top of it, maybe, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 8 in the same time frame. I mean, that's kind of comparing now, and out of the last 4 UFC pay-per-views, 3 of them, we don't know about the last one, but 3 of them could have, speculation on the last one, done over 1 million buys on pay-per-view. That's insane, and that's crazy, and the one that didn't was a taped-delayed pay-per-view, so it wasn't a very strong pay-per-view to start with, or show, but it was tape-delayed, and so I will throw that out there, but no, I don't think so. Hey man, I love your videos, man. I wanted to ask you a question about matters in pride, such as, wanted to let show Young Crow Cop, etc., and whether it was true that they were taking drugs in Japan. I keep hearing these rumors go around, but as a big fan of Pride, I keep rejecting these claims. But since Pride was destroyed and now the fighters are in UFC, even I'm a bit skeptical on how they are performing now since Pride. Can you shed some light on this issue? I would appreciate it if you would cover it in your next Q&A or an email response. Great vids, by the way. Keep up the good work. Peace. Yeah, pretty much I would say that is a huge, major truth that a lot of those guys are on drugs. It was known even back then. Even if you would have asked me back in 2004, I would have said, oh yeah, those guys are probably on drugs. Just from what I know about pro wrestling and the pro wrestling, stuff over there, because the Japanese have it's a cultural thing. It's really hard to explain, but it's more of a cultural thing, and so they're not going to test guys for drugs. It's more of that sort of thing. Trust me, there's business reasons for it too, but it is, the base of it, from the public's perspective, is a cultural thing. And, and so, yeah, I think a lot of those guys were on, who knows what kind of drugs. I don't think they were all on steroids, but I think a lot of them were on something. And I think that's why you've seen a lot of these guys not be as good as when they've come over to UFC, because basically the guys that were on steroids were fighting we're fighting bigger than they are now, and now they're not on them, and now they can't do the same type of things. And there's numerous other drugs that do numerous other sort of things. So there's a lot of that. So yeah, a lot of those guys were doing something, I would say. Let's see. Dana has stated numerous times in the last 2 to 3 months that George St. Pierre can't. If George St. Pierre can beat BJ Penn at UFC 94, which he did, he will be moving up to 185 to fight Anderson Silva for the UFC World Middleweight Championship in the future. What are your thoughts on the possible super fight between Silva and GSP? I think it would be pretty good. I've never seen GSP fight a guy that was notably bigger than him, that I know of. I probably have, and I just didn't realize it. But I think it would be a good fight, and I think that it would be a fight that people would want to see, because I think people are tired of seeing Silva basically beat guys that they don't think are in his class, which leads directly to the next question. I was recently looking at all the buy rates of UFC events for the past couple of years, and I noticed a crazy pattern. All pay-per-views with Anderson Silva on them do terrible. Yes, they do. I wouldn't say terrible, but they're definitely not where you would think they would be. My question is, do you think Dana White keeps talking about Anderson Silva as the best fighter in the world because he wants people to finally buy pay-per-views with Anderson Silva on it? Without a doubt, that's why he's doing it. He's trying to hype him up. I don't think it would necessarily work, because I think most people do think he's the best fighter in the world, and particularly at his weight class, and that he completely dominates guys, and guys are not even in the same realm of him, and I think that is what hurts him. I would call it much like Roy Jones Jr. was in boxing, where he was just so much better and so dominant in his division that there wasn't any compelling fights, and a compelling fight sells. And if it's not compelling, it's not going to sell, and I think that's his big problem. So a fight with GSP, the question before, would be good for that, hopefully, and maybe putting him on TV a bit more would help with that as well. Okay, out of curiosity, since you're both a Pride and Pro Wrestling fan, what was your opinion on the Don Fry Takayama fight from Pride 21? I'm sure there's been more written about this than I've ever read, but I've never read a lot about this. But I wouldn't be shocked if they were both basically paid extra in Pride to basically set their stand-up and do a tough man fight, which is pretty much what they did. If you've never seen the fight, it's pretty amazing from just a brutality standpoint. It's not the most. It's definitely not even close to being the most technical fight you will ever see. But for a show, it was freaking amazing, and probably something that a lot of people should see. Do you think MMA is one of the reasons why wrestling is not as popular as it once was? I personally think so. What are your thoughts? Without a doubt, for one reason, you basically have real pro wrestling, and second, you have guys who are, in some ways, even more charismatic than a lot of pro wrestlers are today. And, where in pro wrestling, and I've talked about this in pro wrestling videos, you have a lot of interviews that are overly scripted, and in MMA that's not the case. And I think you have a lot of people that like that. So there you go. And speaking of which, it seems that most people in the MMA community do not respect pro wrestling in general. With Brock winning the UFC heavyweight title, you would think that the MMA community might start respecting the pro wrestlers, but it seems not to. Will the MMA community ever respect pro wrestling? Not the new fans. I think a lot of older fans do, particularly fans that probably have been watching MMA or aware of MMA and understand the history of MMA. They do, because they probably understand the relevance that pro wrestling, I would hope, would have on MMA, particularly in Japan, where without pro wrestling and without guys that were from pro wrestling basically starting up the early MMA, what wound up being MMA, MMA wouldn't exist as it does today. So without a doubt, I think those fans do. I think newer fans, particularly fans that when UFC really started getting big, when those fans started coming in, I don't think any of those fans do, because I think you have a lot of people that either were pro wrestling fans at one point and just see, pro wrestling is fake and staged and all of this, and they're never going to give it the credit it deserves because they don't want to ever admit one of the things is that they were pro wrestling fans. And the other part of it is you just have people that have never liked pro wrestling, so they're going to down on it anyways without understanding kind of the history of MMA. So there you go. And finally, this question will end up becoming somewhat of a rant against Affliction. So just so you know, after I answer the question, if you want to turn off the video because it goes a bit long, I completely understand. But here we go. Affliction has been in talks with several fighters from Dream and other Japanese promotions such as Shuto and Shinjuku. Which fighters would you personally like to see in Affliction that are currently fighting in these promotions? Well, I will actually make this very easy, because I'm not going to sit down and just start naming off guys, because there would be a whole list of guys that I would like to see them sign. But without a doubt, Arvin being the one heavyweight that I would say, I hope I pronounced his name right, and of course just about every lightweight you can imagine, because to me those are the two weight classes that Affliction needs to focus on. And now comes the rant part of it. And the reason why I say this is because if Affliction truly wants to become big, and I think they can, you know, if you look at it realistically and you look at things down the road and how things are set up, it's like a big stack of dominoes. And, you know, if you've ever set up dominoes to knock them all over and make the little patterns or whatever, you know that it doesn't always work. A domino might not fall right, whatever. But I definitely think there's a stack of dominoes set up which would make Affliction extremely, extremely big. And that's what this rant is going to be about, because I don't think Affliction is doing the right things to do that. And that annoys me, because I do want to see two big MMA companies, both for the fighters, so the fighters can get paid better, and fair, because while I like the fact that Affliction's paying the guys right, I think they are paying them too much. And that would be better for the fighters. And also be better for the fans, because we'll probably see better fights as well. And we won't see some of the stuff that we see in UFC, where they give us fights that were kind of like, you know, So, for that reason, I want to see that. You look at Affliction, and you look at the press conference after Day of Reckoning. And Affliction was asked, you know, about the next pay-per-view, when the next show is going to be, all of this stuff. And Affliction does not get that their biggest problem is not the fighters, is not the shows, it's not anything like that. I think everyone likes that. I think if you look at the response and activity people had from the last pay-per-view, people wanted to see that pay-per-view. Most people thought it was a really good pay-per-view, but they didn't believe the company was going to be around long, so they weren't willing to pay for the pay-per-view. And to me, that is a major problem. So, instead of, when they were asked about when the next show would be, and basically just not answer the question, what they should have done is say, well, we're not ready to answer that yet, because we want to wait until we get the medical suspensions and the drug tests back, so that we don't advertise something we can't deliver. If you say that, you've now diffused that problem. Now, while we've been waiting for the medical suspensions and the drug test to come back, just to make sure everyone was clean, not saying not everyone wouldn't be clean, but just so everyone was clean, they almost definitely need to go after the Elite XC contract. I don't understand why they haven't. I don't understand why they haven't talked about it, even if they just went after it knowing that they wouldn't get it, or knowing that they don't want it, because let's say Showtime says, well, you have to fight in the cage, and Affliction basically wants to stand their ground and say, no, we don't want to fight in the cage because we think the ring gives us an identity and something to separate us from UFC. I understand that. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like the ring, but I think if you do that, you definitely separate yourself, and you've given yourself a little bit of identity, and you're not just another UFC-like promotion. And I also think that when people see a ring in their minds, they're not going to think, the people that automatically think, you know, human cockfighting, are going to think, ooh, boxing with wrestling. That's what I think there's that part of it too. If that's not the case, then, you know, you start talking about negotiating, and then people start thinking, hey, they're in this for real, they really want to go after this, even with the fact that everybody knows that they're not necessarily making any money and they're losing money. The fact of the matter is, there is a business model out there which allows you to lose money up front, and then you make the money on the backside. It is a legitimate business model, except that probably, I think it's depending on, I don't know when the tax breaks, when the tax breaks stop. It's either 4 or 5 years. At that point, you do have to start making money, and you do have to start making back your money, as the case. So there is that, and don't talk about that part of it. Just make it look like, okay, we're going to go after these Elite XC contracts, and you sign those. And then once you have those, you basically admit, okay, we're gonna center our organization around 3 classes: heavyweight, lightweight, and a women's division. And we're gonna bring in 15 women. We're gonna have a legit women's division, and the whole bit. If CBS wants to put on a show, you put on a show, and you put that show on with Gina versus Cyborg as the main event. As crazy as that sounds, I think most people would say it would sell. I think you put that on it. You could also have Tim versus now I can't think of anybody's name. Definitely have Tim versus, give me just a second here. Heavyweights. I was just thinking about this. Tim versus Rothwell. There we go. I was thinking Roethlisberger, and I'm like, that's not Roethlisberger. Rothwell. You have Tim versus Rothwell on the show. You basically say, ooh, look, here we go. As a heavyweight match, you have a light heavyweight match with Little Nog and Babalu, if you can sign it. And you could also have, and you're going to have the Kimbo contract, so you can either A, have a Kimbo rematch, or you can put Kimbo versus Ken Shamrock like it was supposed to be. And